It is my great pleasure to be with you. I'm grateful for all of the people who've been a part of making this day possible. Sister Diane, Father Colleton for the retreat tomorrow, and all the people that I've seen running around here kind of repurposing this gym to make it an auditorium. And thank you for being here. Well, it's January 24th, and 1 month ago today, believe it or not, was Christmas Eve. And that might seem long ago and far away. I hope that you were home with family, school was out, perhaps you were celebrating with friends. Christmas lights and decorations were everywhere. Very soon, though, in a lot of neighborhoods, certainly in commercial places, Christmas was over. Trees dumped out on the street, decorations removed. On the airwaves, Christmas carols were no longer to be heard. But we still kept singing them in church. Through Epiphany, Three Kings, Dia de los Reyes, right up to the baptism of the Lord just a couple of weeks ago. The Christmas lights, the Nativity Scene, the decorations remained. This is my parish church, the Church of St. Juan Diego in Portland, Oregon. And just 2 weeks ago at a Friday evening mass, I walked in and it struck me, we still have the Christmas lights here. We still have the Nativity Scene here. And I said to the pastor, can I take a picture of this? I'm talking about light out of darkness in a couple of weeks. And he said, let me turn off the interior lights for you. So that's the picture of the Christmas lights, the trees, in the dark church just a little over 2 weeks ago. I'm thinking about this because just 2 years ago, at this time exactly, I was returning to the United States after a graced sojourn in Italy, in some of the Dominican holy places. I had the opportunity to be there on this planning commission for the Jubilee Congress of the Order of Preachers, and I went early to spend some precious time in Siena. So I went right after Christmas and spent some days of solitude in Siena, and there I found that Christmas was still very much present. From the end of December to the middle of January, not just in churches, that's Siena, not just in churches, but in the streets, in restaurants. Carols were playing, the Christmas lights were shining. And I want to point out that in that place, the Festival of Light, the true light coming into the world, continued to be celebrated. When I got to Rome, it continued right until the end of January. When I got back to the US, however, what greeted me in the airport? Not a trace of Christmas, Valentine's decorations. In Italy, I found it refreshing that the Christian imagination held sway in the secular streets for such a long time. In our own briskly paced American culture, the season is indeed much briefer. Nevertheless, for a short time, the images of Christmas, the Christ child, the light coming into the world do permeate even our secular streets. It's the job of theologians to connect that cultural intuition and romantic religious notion that in many cases may be merely sentimental with the real meaning of God's incarnation in our world for the most searing issues of justice in our day. I probably don't need to enumerate those for you, but here are just a few. The vast migration of refugees in streaming bands across the globe. The immigration crisis in our own country, and the really deadly drama over the border wall. Slavery in our day. The trafficking of people in general as market slaves, the trafficking of women and children in particular as sex slaves, rampant even in our own country. Black Lives Matter, a renewed response to the scourge of racism that never went away in our country, but that has emerged in bold relief as the veneer of civility has been removed from public rhetoric in our current national climate. The Me Too movement, a whole new chapter in feminism. And the continuing healthcare crisis that disproportionately affects the poorest in our midst. A lot of darkness. But through the Christmas season, at the very heart of the Christian story is the persistent theme of light. At midnight Mass on Christmas Eve, now, where I come from, midnight Mass is never celebrated on Christmas Eve anymore. If you're lucky, it's 10 o'clock. Usually it's 8 o'clock. Sometimes it's 7 o'clock. But it's the Mass for midnight. It's the Mass for midnight. And what we hear before the angels announce the birth of Christ to poor shepherds in the dark of night, we hear the prophecy of Isaiah. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who sat in the region of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. And on Christmas Day, there's a different Mass for Christmas Day. The Gospel of John prepares us for the proclamation that the Word became flesh with this introduction. What came to be through the Word was life. And this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In the weeks after Christmas, we heard from the letter of St. John, "For the darkness is passing away, and the true light is already shining." Yet, amidst these scriptures, not just in our own contemporary news, but amidst these scriptures of the New Testament, there were other scriptures testifying to the effects of darkness even then, after the true light had come into the world. Some of these effects I found depicted artistically in the Crypt church of San Domenico in Siena. Yes. Now, San Domenico is the church that St. Catherine, believe it or not, worshipped in the 14th century. And underneath it, after her time, was built a crypt church, which is what they really use now. The original church is more of a museum where you get to go and look at relics and things. But downstairs was where they had Mass. And down there, they had this incredible nativity scene, which I wish you could see better. But it was a sprawling affair situated on real grass with, now, the nativity scene, right, the birth of Jesus. Dominic and Catherine are there, anachronistically prominent amongst the adorers of Christ. Most captivating, though, I don't know if you can see them, but the black and white, the two black and white figures, Dominic and Catherine. Most captivating, though, was this diverse array of adorers, each with implicit symbolism. Who's coming to offer gifts to the Christ child? Besides the shepherds and the magi, there are men carrying logs of wood, perhaps signifying Joseph's and eventually Jesus's craft of carpentry, and heralding the cross. Musicians of various kinds worshiping with their gifts, and women of regal stature, along with peasant women of the land bearing their gifts. And most intriguingly, a figure that seems like a modern homeless person, sitting in his rags, holding up a fork in his hand, coming with what he had, coming before the Christ child with his hunger. Then, as I settled into Mass, I was taken in by this huge crucifix over the altar with a more than life-size painted corpus. And at the foot of the cross, the baby Jesus in a manger. I don't know if you can see that, and I don't know what liturgical theologians might think of that, resting upon the tabernacle. But for me, it was evocative of the logs of wood borne by several adorers in the Nativity Scene, the birth in the shadow of the cross, through which somehow, mysteriously, comes life. We can never, you see, simply rest in the joy of the Christmas scene or the celebrations of the season. Even at the birth of Christ, long before the crucifixion, that inbreaking of light and love in the flesh immediately drew the jealous wrath of Herod, who sought to eradicate the threat to his power, the threat that this newborn king posed. And he eradicated that threat, he thought, by massacring all of the boy babies of Bethlehem, the holy innocents. Between the diverse figures of the Nativity Scene, the cross, and the creche over the tabernacle, not to mention the present action of the Eucharist, which was about to take place as I viewed all these things in the 21st century, there are many stories interwoven here. The figures in various types of garb representing various centuries in succession after the birth of Jesus. There's a pluralism of stories here that contrast light and darkness. The great 20th century Dominican theologian Edward Skilobex reflects on the story of his life as a thread woven into the great story of the order of preachers through time. The Dominican story, which is rooted in the much older foundational story of Jesus of Nazareth. We see images of this interweaving in the Nativity Scene, garb of later centuries revealing how subsequent generations participate in the incarnation narrative in and through their own place and calling in life, in and through the offering of their particular gifts, which become woven into the story of the Word becoming flesh, the light coming into the world. Dominic and Catherine's contributions are luminous strands in this story. Situated as they are in that scene, though, in this scene, they represent the whole Dominican family through history, which now includes you, believe it or not. If you are a student, a faculty member, a staff member, but especially a student being formed by Ohio Dominican University, you are a thread being woven into that long and great Dominican story, which is just a part of the story of the Word made flesh. There you are. In keeping with Ohio Dominican University's theme of justice throughout this academic year, my focus today, clearly, is on light out of darkness, Dominican stories of justice, and I'd like to amend that to Dominican stories of justice and hope, because we cannot address the searing issues of suffering, the questions of justice in our day, without also being bearers of hope. So while I'm telling these stories, I'd like to invite you to think about your own story, your personal story. Where do you fit in this? St. Gregory of Nazianzus, an early father of the church, writes, "You are to be radiant lights. You are to be radiant lights as you stand beside Christ, the great light, bathed in the glory of the one who is the light of heaven. You are to be radiant lights. How do you advance justice in the world? How are you a bearer of hope? In other words, how is your life a light in the darkness? That is a threefold question, spelling out a challenge expressed by the holy prophet Simeon in the story of the presentation of the child Jesus in the temple, when Jesus' parents bring him to present him in the temple. Simeon tells Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, that their child will be a light to reveal God to the nations. What a wonderful thing, a light. Doesn't every parent wish that his and her child was a light to reveal the holy, to reveal the divine? But then Simeon says something very ominous. Behold, this child is destined to be a sign that will be contradicted. You see, to be light in the world, and think about your life. Think about your life with your friends, your life in the dorm, your social life, the places in your life where you struggle, perhaps where you struggle to tell the truth. To be light in the world is to simultaneously reveal the truth of God, and when you do that, you uncover darkness. We're always in the contrast. To be light is to uncover darkness. It's what light does. Reveals the darkness, uncovers the forces of evil, and exposes evil's conspirators. Today, as at the birth of Jesus, that paradox is all around us. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In the order of preachers, the light of God's revelation is equated with truth, veritas, which, as you know, is the Dominican motto. Well, one of three Dominican mottos. Veritas, contemplare all'istradere, to contemplate and share the fruits of contemplation, and that's emblazoned across one of your buildings, and I have to confess I don't know what building it is. Is that the entrance? Yes, okay, it's the entrance. To praise, to bless, and to preach, which really expresses our manner of being the light of the world, affirming the goodness of God's creation. And we praise, bless, and preach not by being in church, though that's good and it's at the right times, but we praise, bless, and preach by affirming goodness of God's creation, by affirming the goodness in each other, which I can only imagine these two ODU students laughing with each other on the grass are doing, conveying light, reflecting back each other's light. It was the darkness of untruth plaguing the church in the 13th century that led Dominic to found the Order of Preachers, and it's with that story that I'd like to begin. I know you feel like I really began a long time ago, but Dominic de Guzman, known as our founder, but you know, he never set out to be. In fact, there's a great Dominican writer who says in a poem, founded, no, friended. They say Dominic friended an order. What came to be this order was the result of relationships that he formed, friendships that he formed in his search for truth and in finding companions in that search. He was a quiet, learned priest, and we get a glimpse of his heart from the stories of his student days when there was a famine in Palencia where he was studying, and he loved his books. I don't know, how many of you love your books? Or the stuff you get on Kindle. But he loved his books, but he sold them because he couldn't bear, his heart broke at seeing people hungry. Another glimpse into his heart. They say about Dominic that he had the gift of tears. Now, sometimes I get really emotional in a really inappropriate place, and I get kind of embarrassed when I can't hold them back. But the tradition tells us that it's a gift. Dominic's gift of tears tells us how compassionate he was. that he cried over the crisis of truth as he cried over the crisis of hunger. He cried over the yearning for spiritual nourishment, because this was a time of deep corruption in the church, deep corruption. And people were not hearing the refreshing word of truth that they needed to hear. There was at that time a heresy rampant to the point of bloodshed, where there was kind of a new kind of Catholicism that was a heresy. It was Gnosticism, and it was basically a belief system that denigrated the flesh. It was completely spiritual. To be holy and to be like God, you have to be pure spirit. Well, what do we do with these bodies? What do we do with this world? What do we do with created matter? Well, Dominic knew the truth, as Thomas did, that after him, that all of this comes from God, and this is good. We need to affirm this goodness. And so he fought against that heresy. And another piece of this story is some of the people preaching this heresy were living what seemed to be a more authentic life than the official church leaders, who were pretty bound up in wealth and power and didn't seem so very authentic. So what Dominic and his friend Diego did was say, we've got to correct that heresy. But these people have some of the truth. They got the poverty element. They got the authenticity element of living the apostolic life. And that's what we need to model. Where's the truth in this heresy that we can embrace while we correct the damaging falsehood? And so they became poor, simple preachers, proclaiming the truth that what God created is good, including your body, including your relationships, including this earth that we live on, including the wheat that makes the bread that we consecrate for the body of Christ, and the grapes that make the wine that we consecrate for the blood of Christ. See, they thought the sacraments were bad too, because they were made of the earth. In all of this, Dominic came to be known as Lumen Ecclesiae, a light in the church, a light in the church. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So I'd like to think that you here walk in the footsteps of Dominic. Now, I swiped that photo off the website, your website, and I don't know if those three young men knew that they were walking in the footsteps of Dominic there, but it sure looks like it. And in those footsteps, I'd like you to take a moment to think, and then to turn to the person next to you and answer these questions. The heresy we were talking about of Gnosticism that condemns matter, that separates, this is evil and this is good and holy, and severs those things from each other. We call that dualism, separating the body from the soul, the spirit from the flesh. Dualism, sometimes we see that with communities. That operates in communities. So dualism separates, it divides, it condemns what is other. And I want to ask you, do you think that the heresy of dualism exists today? And if you do, what are some examples that come to mind? And how might these dualisms be harmful? Just take a moment, think about that, and turn to the person next to you and share that thought. Okay. Well, there's one of two things going on here. Either you've realized that the list of dualisms in our own day is almost inexhaustible, or else you found something else really interesting to talk about. So, throughout history, the charism of Dominic has been evident in the lives of his sisters and brothers, daughters and sons, always taking the form demanded by their context. It's always about responding to the signs of the times around you. So here, at the risk of sounding like those introductions to the Law and Order shows, here are some of their stories. Catherine of Siena was born in 1347. She only lived 33 years, same number as Jesus, but accomplished a tremendous amount. She was a passionate and powerful woman. I think you have a saying here called passion with a purpose. Is that your saying? Well, she certainly had passion with a purpose. She challenged popes. She challenged princes and priests. She called a corrupt church, so a century after Dominic, there was still corruption, different kinds of corruption now. She called it to unite and to be what it's meant to be for the world. We hear Pope Francis saying this a lot today. He says the church is meant to be a vehicle of mercy for the world, a vehicle of mercy, and that was Catherine's message. She reconciled warring factions. She was a peacemaker, and not just in the church, but amidst Italian city-states. And at the same time, cared for the poor in the streets, for victims of the plague, when it was very dangerous to be caring for victims of the plague, the Black Plague. She cared for prisoners, attended them at their executions, promised them the mercy of God. She did all of this out of this profound relationship she had with God in Christ, whom she called God, she called Christ first truth. And she had lots of tender endearments with that. It was a personal relationship, but God was first truth, the source of everything. And in her commitment to mediate God's truth and God's mercy in her context, she became light, who she was meant to be. And she continues with that light to influence the Dominican family as sister and companion. I can tell you that many of us Dominican women particularly draw strength from her these days. She had this great motto that we're going to come back to later in a much more contemporary context. She said, "Silence kills. Silence kills. Preach as though you had a million voices. It is silence that kills the world." Another great Dominican figure, two actually, whose lives were intertwined, are Antonio de Montesinos, born in 1475, and Bartolome de las Casas, born in 1484. Now, their context, to which they responded, was the context of the conquest of the New World by those Spaniards those Catholic Spaniards, of whom Montesinos and de las Casas, with whom they identified, conquistadores, who came with their chaplains to baptize these pagan indigenous people, but really they came to take over lands and to extract the wealth of those lands. Think that's still going on? Except not with the baptism part. Well, and a current, and where they were located was Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And what they witnessed was the attacks of the conquistadors on the indigenous Indians. Attacks on their human dignity. And a current theologian, and I'm proud to say Dominican, Gustavo Gutierrez, the father of liberation theology, he writes this in his huge biography of Las Casas. When we talk about the conquest, what are we talking about? This is the way he interprets it. We mean the encounter, no, not encounter, collision, unexpected on both sides, not only between the peoples of the territory today called America and those who lived in Europe, but including Africa as well, a third continent promptly and violently incorporated into the process of which we speak. This event is regarded as a discovery by those who see history from the old continent, as they themselves call it, a covering, others call it, darkness, covering, a covering, others call it, referring to a history written in blatant disregard of the viewpoint of the so-called inhabitants of the New World. The Conquista, it was dubbed in the old history books. Invasion, some prefer to call it today. Gustavo Gutierrez. And in the ministry of Antonio de Montesinos was a Dominican friar living in a Dominican community, and with his community, together they were outraged by the attacks on the indigenous people by the conquistadors. Now they were in a bind. They're Spanish Dominican friars, priests. They're ministering and providing sacraments to the Spaniards who've come for the conquest. And those Spaniards receiving their sacraments are attacking the dignity and torturing enslaving these indigenous people. Well, they were going to do something about it. And so there was this famous Advent sermon, and the thing about the Dominicans is from the beginning the order was called the Holy Preaching. The community is the Holy Preaching. And while Antonio Montesinos is famous for delivering this sermon, it was written by the community, the Advent sermon of 1511, when he says, "Tell me, with what right, with what justice do you hold these Indians in such cruel and horrible servitude? Are they not human beings?" It was the preaching of the community. And amongst the people listening to that preaching, there was Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a priest, a sort of a diocesan priest from Spain who was there, who was himself a slaveholder because they didn't think anything of it. He probably treated his slaves better than others. But upon hearing this preaching, he found himself convicted. And he saw the light and the darkness of his ways. And he was converted to free his slaves. And he became a Dominican and joined that Dominican community and became part of the work on behalf of the human dignity of the indigenous people. Tremendous impact on him. And on the other side of the ocean, a tremendous impact on Francisco Vitoria, a professor of law. He's known beyond religious and ecclesiastical circles as foundational in the construction of human rights, having constructed the foundations of human rights law. Well, he was impacted by this too, as this word reached him across the ocean, also a Dominican, and began to work from his scholarly perspective on the human dignity, on laws that would uphold the human dignity of the indigenous people. And that is called today the Salamanca process, where intellectual dimensions of the order are in conversation and communion with members of the order working on the ground, working in grassroots places with the poor, learning from each other and providing a more integrated kind of service, outreach, and proclamation. When we think about the plight of the indigenous people in the 16th century on our own American continent, because we are all America, Latin America and North America, when we think about that, we cannot help but think about the immigration crisis today on our shores. We cannot help but think about people seeking to cross a border into a land which was once theirs, crossing a border into a land which was once theirs before we moved the border. That land was taken from them, and all you have to do is look at the news, to wherever you look at it, or wherever you listen to it, to know the suffering that is taking place on that border now. Next figure, not yet, from the same period in history, the same century, only in Peru this time, St. Martin de Porres, Lima, Peru. He was born of a Spanish father and, as they said in those days, Negro mother. And so as this sort of mixed blood, mixed race, he was not accepted anywhere. He was despised by his aristocratic father. An intelligent boy, he was befriended by a doctor who taught him the art of healing. He was drawn to prayer at a young age and eventually entered the Dominicans as a brother. At the church of Santo Domingo in Lima, which I had the privilege of being able to visit a number of years ago, he served as a porter. And a porter is someone who greets you at the door, who welcomes people. And often the people he welcomed were the poor seeking food, the poor people suffering from other things, seeking solace and mercy. He was also a barber. He was a listener and a healer, and is known for working many miracles. Canonized by Pope John XXIII in 1962, Martin is the first Black person from the New World recognized as a saint, and he is the patron of the poor. Now, I'd like to jump several centuries to the 20th century, already not our own century, but to a very prominent figure whose life and legacy we just celebrated at the beginning of this week, Martin Luther King Jr. While we're on these issues, he's so connected in his commitment and his passion to the passions and the purposes of Montesinos and Las Casas. We know that enslavement continued in our country, and long after the Civil War and long after the abolition of slavery, we know all of the ways that slavery and persecution and racism continued. And we know how it continues today. So certainly, Martin de Porres, in his life, experienced the effects of racism, though they might not have had that terminology then. There's a connection here to Catherine of Siena. Martin Luther King said, our lives begin to end. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And when our lives begin to end, we're moving toward death. Remember, Catherine of Siena said, preach as though you had a million voices. It is silence that kills the world. And so Martin Luther King, assassinated over 50 years ago, and it would have been his 90th birthday this year. All these decades later, what are we dealing with? A new surge. Not a new surge of racism, just a new surge of evidence of it, a new realization of it, a new depth in the Black Lives Matter movement. And I found this picture of a protest with this wonderful sign that said, white silence is violence. White silence is violence. And to move this up, because I'm going over time, to the 21st century, Dominican stories of justice and hope continue in the 21st century. I have family in Iraq. Now, I'm sure I stayed in the Mother House last night, and going down the hall, I noticed a beautiful display about our sisters, our Dominican sisters in Iraq, and I imagine some of you students know something about Dominicans in Iraq. This is Sister Lima, a biblical scholar in Iraq. I have family in Iraq. So ever since the beginning of the Iraq War, I'm going to leave my notes down because it'll take too long, but you may know that our sisters ministered peacefully in Iraq. And they served both Christians and Muslims in healthcare and in education. And when President Bush was threatening to begin the Iraq War, threatening to bomb Iraq, they wrote letters begging him not to, because it would tear their country apart. Well, what happened? It's torn their country apart. The violence has continued. The Muslims who were their neighbors were turned against them. Now everyone who was Christian was seen as aligned with the West. and the persecution of Christians began. In 2014, they were forced to flee Iraq, many of them who were in Mosul, after experiencing bombings in Mosul, experiencing terrible bombings and violence. When ISIS was coming in and they got word, they fled with their people, and they fled on foot, in vehicles. They went with them and set up refugee camps in Erbil and Ankara. And there, with nothing but eventually some of these little containers, which are hot in the heat and cold in the winter, they served the people. They continued to try to provide these people with the children with education, people with health care, all of them with pastoral presence, being light in the present moment, bringing light, even though they could see no future. There was this sense of powerlessness and inability to see the future. Sister Luma Cooter described their existential experience of powerlessness, yet unable even to imagine what the future might be, they continued to seek resources, establish schools so that children might resume their educations, that health care might be provided, that worship and sacraments might be provided. And over the last years, they've been able slowly to return to their villages on the Nineveh Plain, to return to Mosul. Their convent outside of Mosul in Teleskuf has been restored, and the sisters have been using it to provide education and daycare for children until their school can be rebuilt. Last Easter, they wrote this: "Deep down, people and the sisters with them ask, how long will this time of quietness last?" They still feel the threat of the terrorists, even as they seek to rebuild their lives. And they said, maybe we need to understand that God is calling us to a new sense of being where we have to embrace all the paradoxes, the light and the darkness, all the paradoxes of our reality, and move on trusting that with Him, what we do has salvific meaning. The darkness is still there. The future is uncertain. But in the present, the Iraqi Dominicans remain as light for their people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. One more really quick. I can't leave this out. Okay. Very close to home for you, the final Dominican light, very briefly, I'd like to lift up. Someone who for some years in her life, taught here at ODU, at Ohio Dominican University, Dominican Sister of Peace and artist, Sister Thomas Swanson. She was on mission in Peru, where she, as an artist, drew forth the artistic gifts of women so that they could make beautiful things and sell them and be independent and create resources for their family. She's been committed to the relationship between justice and beauty, leading to an enhancement of people's dignity. Amongst many other recognitions, she was a recipient of the Mother Teresa Award. So I just want you to know that right here, very close, and her art studio is here in Columbus, the light shines, and many of her pieces of art are around this building, and I gather in the windows and elsewhere of the new chapel. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And I just want to return. I began with some pictures of the lights in my own church back in Portland. How many lighted trees are there? Well, I don't know about you, but when I was in the church, I'd be looking at the glass and I thought there were multiple lighted trees, and I went up close, and it's one tree reflected and refracted in the glass, in the window, in the dark. You see, when your light shines, it spreads, it is multiplied, like the stars in the sky, beyond your ability to count. And how much more so when you join your light to that of others, when you join with others in relationship, with companions seeking truth. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, and you are meant to be bearers of that light. Thank you.